As we see a rise in authoritarianism in this left trench era, we will see a corresponding rise of hypocrats, that is, hypocritical leadership. People imposing laws on the populace that they're not willing or not able to follow themselves. This is a feature of authoritarian regimes. Now, the authoritarians of Jesus' day were a group called the Pharisees, and Jesus noted of them, the Pharisees don't practice what they teach. They crush people with unbearable religious demands and never lift a finger to ease the burden. Everything they do is for show. On their arms, they wear extra wide prayer boxes with scripture verses inside, and they wear robes with extra long tassels, and they love to sit at the head table at banquets and in the seats of honor in the synagogues. They love to receive respectful greetings as they walk in the marketplaces and to be called rabbi. But what sorrow awaits you teachers of religious law and you Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are so careful to clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside you are filthy, full of greed and indulgence. You blind Pharisee! First wash the inside of the cup and dish, and then the outside will become clean too. What sorrow awaits you teachers of religious law and you Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside, but filled on the inside with dead people's bones and all sorts of impurity. Outwardly, you look like righteous people, but inwardly your hearts are filled with hypocrisy and lawlessness. Snakes, sons of vipers, how will you escape the judgment of hell? So the Pharisees liked having power, they liked the prestige, they liked to sit at banquets and to parade down the streets and receive the adulation of the people. But the rules that they imposed on their society, they were unwilling or unable to follow themselves. They were hypocrites. Authoritarian rulers are always the same. Fast forward to the 20th century and Joseph Stalin and Chairman Mao, and the pattern repeats. They demanded that all the little worker ants live in state-owned homes, for example, but of course they themselves lived in privately owned property. They demand that all the little worker ants had small basic accommodation, but they lived in palaces. They demanded the ants live on meager food supplies, yet they feasted like kings. They demanded that ants have no wealth of their own, yet Stalin and Mao had vast hoards of wealth. They demanded the ants be not free to think or speak their own mind, yet they exempted themselves of that restriction. They could speak their mind at will. Stalin and Mao crushed people with unbearable demands. They loved to parade in public and receive the adulation of the people. They loved to banquet and sit in the seats of honor, but they were unwashed cups and whitewashed tombs. They were snakes, sons of vipers, hypocrites, hypocrats. Now fast forward again to 2020, and COVID-19 saw Western civilization experiencing this lurch towards authoritarian rule with almost incomprehensible speed. Although you could say that the nanny state had been gradually expanding ever since 1967, and people were definitely aware of growing government intrusion in their daily lives throughout those decades, it was in 2020 that our civilization really crossed the Rubicon in a very sudden and alarming way, and this was all down to COVID-19. You see, when COVID-19 happened, the free democracies of the world were a bit unsure of how to respond to it, and it was in the middle of that uncertainty that communist China came to the fore. The Chinese government were feeling pretty smug about themselves at the beginning of 2020, if the truth be told. Being a totalitarian state that had reduced their population to worker ants, they were able to order all of them inside their homes as part of a national lockdown, and having done this, they subsequently mocked the West for its ideas of democratic individual freedoms that would restrict them from doing the same thing. Through their English language news outlet, Global Times, they taunted the West. One headline said, "The world is now entering a global test of governance in which China is the leader." Another on 15th of March 2020 read, "Many Western governments ill-equipped to handle coronavirus." Still another from 22nd of March said, "Western political system gets a radical health check." In one of these articles they wrote, "While the global health crisis may still have a long way to run, a number of things are already clear. First, viruses affect all nationalities. Second, China has done an impressive job with the pandemic. And third, other countries who don't follow China's lead have done a worse job, especially Western liberal democracies." It continued, "There is much to admire about the US and the individual liberties that are such a sacrosanct part of its identity, at least in theory. That sentence is dripping with sarcasm. And then responding to the idea that some Asian democracies had actually fared pretty well against COVID-19, they said, while it's true that some Asian democracies such as Singapore and South Korea seem to have done a good job, that's only because they allow high levels of state intervention. Western democracies like Australia probably won't be able to follow that success. In other words, the Chinese government was taunting the West, saying the only way that you can handle a crisis like this is to become more authoritarian, more communist, more like us. Our method of governance is simply superior to yours. The article finished by saying, China's response has been impressive, but it's too soon to declare victory or to be smug about the problems of the West. Now, back in the UK, these taunts were being heard loud and clear, and the government bought all of this propaganda. This is why, under Prime Minister Boris Johnson, the Coronavirus Act 2020 was swiftly introduced in the United Kingdom. This piece of legislation effectively suspended democracy and gave the government near unlimited so-called emergency powers to rule by decree. Through this act, laws can now be introduced without going through the normal democratic processes of scrutiny, debate and votes. These decrees would be legally binding upon the populace, and arbitrary punishments could be dished out upon citizens who didn't comply. So Britain effectively went through a very abrupt process of Chinification. Indeed, using these new limitless powers granted to themselves through the Coronavirus Act, the British government then formally announced a communist-style national lockdown on the 23rd of March 2020 that would force individuals to stay inside their homes 24/7, exactly as China had done. This happened indeed just days after that wave of taunts that had come through the Chinese Global Times. Further mirroring China, protests against these measures were swiftly banned. Complete compliance with the diktats was demanded. Anyone flouting lockdowns would be investigated by the police and duly punished. Drones and other forms of mass surveillance were used to monitor the population from the air, and some were apprehended for merely walking their dog in the countryside or for going to the park. Government officials during this period encouraged people to snitch on their neighbours if they believed that they were not conforming and leaving their home without government approval, bringing back memories of the Stasi. Businesses and churches were forcibly closed and hefty fines were issued for those who didn't comply. The furlough scheme was introduced that made people dependent on government handouts for their income. A track and trace app was launched whereby individuals had to log their movements on government databases, detailing where they'd been and for how long. And all the while, any free speech that contradicted the accepted narrative around coronavirus was shut down. With the help of big tech, and especially social media companies like YouTube, Facebook, Twitter and Instagram, people who asserted independent thought and who questioned the narrative were considered dangerous dissenters and were often censored or removed from these platforms, even if their assertions had scientific foundation, even if these assertions were true. And this was enacted so that only one type of thought could be heard, so that all the people of the world might be choreographed to speak in unison. Now, the almost instantaneous switch from free liberal democracy to authoritarian rule was staggering. Indeed, such was the scope of the power that the government granted itself that when they first considered doing this in the West, they didn't believe it would be possible in a country like the United Kingdom, a place with such a strong democratic tradition. Professor Neil Ferguson, part of the government's SAGE group, admitted in an interview with the Times in 2020 that it was by looking to communist China that they were first given the idea of lockdowns. He said, I think people's sense of what is possible in terms of control changed quite dramatically between January and March 2020. After witnessing communist China implementing lockdowns, they thought, but it's a communist one-party state. We couldn't get away with it in Europe. But then Italy did it, and we realised we could. Now, under this severe and crushing authoritarian rule that demanded complete social isolation, separation of friends and families, even to the point of being banned from being with loved ones as they lay dying, or even attending the funerals of parents and children and aunts and uncles and grandparents, you can bet that the rulers made exceptions for themselves. You can bet that the rulers didn't follow their own rules. After Boris Johnson announced a national lockdown, you can be sure that he permitted himself to keep going about his business as usual. Even though the lockdown rules commanded that people not travel more than 5 miles from their front door to exercise, Johnson himself was later spotted flouting those rules by riding his bike 7 miles away. Even though he banned social gatherings for ordinary people, he had social gatherings and allowed multiple parties at his home at 10 Downing Street. Some of these occasions allegedly saw 40 or 50 people crammed cheek by jowl into a medium-sized room. Some of these events maybe even had hundreds of people at them, according to some reports. Johnson and his then Chancellor Rishi Sunak were also contacted by the Test and Trace app in July 2021, which for ordinary people at that time meant remaining at home in quarantine under pain of severe punishment. However, when it applied to himself, Johnson decided to ignore those rules and continue about his business. Other government officials around Johnson also routinely flouted their own rules. Johnson's chief advisor, Dominic Cummings, one of the key architects of the UK lockdowns, was caught breaking lockdown rules when he drove from London to Durham and then had a day out at Barnard Castle. The aforementioned Neil Ferguson, another key architect of the UK lockdown, was revealed on 6th of May 2020 to have been leaving his home quite regularly to go and visit his mistress. Matt Hancock, the UK Government Health Secretary at the time of the crisis, the man who used his daily TV briefings to say to ordinary people that they should be hammered for breaking the rules, the man who had called for people to snitch on their neighbours if they broke the rules like the Stasi. Well, he was found to be breaking them himself the whole time by having an affair with his secretary. In December 2020, Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland, after insisting that people wear masks indoors at all times, she was photographed talking to 3 people at a funeral without a mask. Catherine Calderwood, the Chief Medical Officer for Scotland, was caught out visiting her holiday home in April 2020. Margaret Ferrier, a Member of Parliament for the Scottish Government, despite testing positive for coronavirus in October 2020, promptly travelled by train from Scotland to London. The Welsh First Minister, Mark Drakeford, also imposed stringent social distancing and mask-wearing rules upon ordinary people in Wales. He frequently warned that if people did not obey his decrees, they would be punished, and punished harshly. And yet, on the 16th of November 2021, he was filmed at a Diwali celebration dancing on a packed dance floor without a mask and surrounded by others who were not wearing masks either. Unwashed cups, all of them. Whitewashed tombs, hypocrites. They crush people with unbearable demands and never lift a finger to ease the burden. Everything they do is for show. How they love to sit at the head table at banquets and receive honour and respect as they walk in the marketplaces. Snakes, broods of vipers, hypocrites. Although COVID-19 has faded away, authoritarian hypocrisy is rearing its head in other places. As I make this series, there's a lot of alarmist rhetoric occurring over climate change right now, and every year the elites of the world are congregating for United Nations summits on what to do about it. Now, despite the elites telling the public for years that air travel is one of the biggest contributors to carbon emissions and that we must therefore all stop flying to save the planet, we all have to stop going on our holidays. At the 2021 conference in Glasgow, these same elites used 400 private jets to get there. These jets were estimated to have blasted a combined 13,000 tons of CO2 into the atmosphere, more gas than 1,600 ordinary people would burn through in a whole year. So in other words, you, the little people, have to stop flying, you have to stop going on your holidays, but we, the important people, will carry on doing what we want. Indeed, just 3 months before arriving at the 2021 conference to make a speech, Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, launched himself into space on a private rocket ship. Unwashed cups, whitewashed tombs, hypocrites. Another thing the elites have been telling us for years is that we will all have to stop using private cars powered by gasoline. Indeed, at the time of making this series, the UK government has outlined plans to ban the sale of petrol cars from 2030. They say that we must all learn to walk and cycle more or inconvenience ourselves with other modes of transport, whether it be mass transport or electric vehicles. However, prior to his arrival at the COP26 conference, US President Joe Biden had used an 85-vehicle motorcade to meet the Pope. and all of them had burned fossil fuels. A number of other world leaders were spotted arriving at COP26 in fossil fuel vehicles, and these were also spotted clogging up the streets of Glasgow around the summit, even idling while stationary in back streets. So in other words, you the little people can do without your cars from now on, but the rules don't apply to us. We need our cars. Unwashed cups, whitewashed tombs, hypocrites. In recent times, the UK government has made plans to ban the installation of gas boilers in new homes by 2025. Indeed, the International Energy Agency has suggested that no new gas boiler should be allowed anywhere in the world from that year. Instead, it has been proposed that the general public switch to heat pumps that are costly to install and not necessarily that efficient in colder climates. However, after demanding that the general public make that switch, the Telegraph approached 30 serving UK government ministers to ask if they had done it themselves, and not a single one of them had. In other words, you the little people can be cold, you can move to an ineffective, inconvenient and expensive heating system, but the rules don't apply to us. We're too important, we have to stay warm. Unwashed cups, whitewashed tombs, hypocrites. So a consistent pattern of behaviour is developing amongst our leaders, which says that while we must stay locked in our homes under authoritarian diktats, stripped of individual agency, masked, silenced, inconvenienced, micromanaged, controlled, sacrificing our income, the practice of our faith, connection with our friends and families, our travel plans, and even the warmth of our homes, no such rules apply to the elites. They will carry on doing exactly what they have been doing. And as we go deeper into the postmodern age, and as authoritarian rule is increasingly tolerated in our time, I believe that this will probably become a defining mark of our time. State-sponsored hypocrisy, elites telling us what we should do, but not doing it themselves. In other words, hypocrites.
There's a difference between us. You think the people of this country exist to provide you with position. I think your position exists to provide those people with freedom.